our key focus on India Global this week. One of the world's biggest climate huddles, the COP28, has come out with its outcome document. The big focus and the key takeaway of this year was, of course, climate equality and the needs of the global south. Now, fossil fuels have been a contentious issue, particularly the language around it as far as the outcome document is concerned. Now, COP28 nations have called for transitioning away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly and equitable manner. The aim? Well, the aim is to achieve the target of net zero emissions by 2050. Now, critics, however, say that the removal of the phrase phasing out of fossil fuels from the outcome document is a big failure on the part of COP nations. This is something that a lot of climate advocacy groups have said. But meanwhile, in a big breakthrough, the Loss and Damage Fund has also been approved. Now, this is key because this fund aims to correct the wrongs done by the West vis-a-vis developing countries as far as their climate initiatives are concerned. Because all the time when we talk about climate equality and climate change, the onus is somehow on global south countries and the developing nations. But the big question now is, are all these measures enough? Several targets have been set, including the bid to triple renewable energy by 2030. But will these pledges really translate into actionable outcomes? That's what we're looking at as far as our discussion around COP28 is concerned. And joining me now, Mr. Harjeet Singh, who's the head of global political strategy at the Climate Action Network International. Thanks very much, Mr. Singh, for joining us on India Global. My first question, straight up, how do you look at the outcomes of the COP28? What is your perspective as far as the outcome document is concerned?
Thank you, Vedant, for having me in this very important conversation. I would say that this was a historic yet a flawed deal. The reason I say historic, as you mentioned, after 30 long years, finally, the issue of fossil fuels, that is coal, oil and gas, took center stage. And the reason it was important because we know that fossil fuels are responsible for more than 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, and they are the primary drivers of the climate crisis. And the issue was avoided for more than 3 decades. Now, some of the important targets have been put on the table, as you mentioned, on renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency. But the mention of just, orderly and equitable transition is extremely important for a country like India. But where it failed, not only because it has several loopholes, it talks about carbon capture and storage, it talks about how we can continue to burn fossil fuels by using these unproven technologies, but also it doesn't really provide any substantive finance for developing countries like India or Nigeria or Indonesia to actually transition away from fossil fuels. That is a key question. So we have talked about what needs to be done, although not strong, but we totally missed the question how it's going to happen.
That's a very important point, and I'll come to the finance bit also. But talking about actionable outcomes, there was so much conversation about, around the language that was used in the outcome document, phasing out versus phasing down, and finally it's come down to reducing fossil fuels. Do you see that as a climb down as far as our response to fossil fuel production is concerned, number one? And number two, you also talked about alternatives and countries like India. The whole conversation around coal versus oil and gas. Well, India is not a position to switch or transition away entirely from coal. So do you think even now the developing nations have to bear the brunt of many wrongs done by the West?
Well, absolutely. Number one, yes, it's a climb down. We were demanding that it should be phased out because that is far more certain and measurable. Transitioning away, you can't really put a yardstick saying what will you define transitioning away. So it's not as strong. Yet it's an information and indication that finally fossil fuels are going to be phased out in one way or the other. So I think the message is very important, particularly for the financial sector, to stop investing into fossil fuels. That's one. Now, whether it is fair for India, so there's also a mention of phasing down of coal. And I think it's important that it is now being brought to the parity where we at COP26 in 2021 only talked about coal, whereas rich countries continue to expand oil and gas production. And I can tell you that 5 countries, so US, UK, Australia, Canada, and Norway, are responsible for more than 50% of increasing these fossil fuel extraction
Yes.
between now and 2050. So it is hypocrisy on their part that they are putting pressure on India to reduce coal when they continue to expand other fossil fuels such as oil and gas.
And taking a cue from what you just said, you also talked about finance being provided to developing nations and countries of the global south. But talking about the loss and damage fund and the compensation, so to speak, that is being given to these developing nations for the wrongs done by the West vis-a-vis the developing nations as far as climate change is concerned, do you think it's enough? And are we talking about climate equality or climate equity in the real sense of the term? Or do you see it just as a vague document that's not going to translate on the ground at all?
Well, again, I would still call it historic and unprecedented because it never happened that
especially because at least it got approved. At least the loss and damage fund got approved.
Exactly. So approved last year and operationalized this year. And to the extent that $700 million have been committed, absolutely not enough. We are looking into needs in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet it's a start. It's also an admission of the responsibility for rich countries to provide money. Right. I think that is important. Right. The language of compensation and reparations is not there, but the principle still stands.
Right.
And for developing
so it is still a giant leap forward, but remains to be seen how the outcome document is finally implemented. Thanks very much, Mr. Singh, for joining us on India Global this week on that very important conversation.